The ocean was still asleep. At least that was how Elias Mercer liked to think about it. Each morning, before the first light appeared on the horizon, he would step outside the lighthouse and listen. Not to the wind, not to the gulls, not even to the waves. He listened to the silence that existed between them. For more than 40 years, Elias had lived at Gullstone Point Lighthouse, a lonely tower standing on a rocky stretch of coast along the cold waters of Maine. The lighthouse was not famous. Most maps barely mentioned it. Most travelers never knew its name. But every night, its light reached far across the dark Atlantic Ocean, guiding ships safely along the coastline. And for Elias, that was enough. He had never wanted fame. He had never wanted excitement. He simply wanted the light to continue shining. On this particular morning in the winter of 1958, the sky was covered in soft gray clouds. The sea looked like brushed silver beneath them. A thin layer of frost covered the wooden railing outside the lighthouse. Elias pulled his wool coat a little tighter and walked toward the lantern room at the top of the tower. His boots made familiar sounds against the iron staircase. Sounds he had heard thousands of times, perhaps tens of thousands. The climb was slow now. At 68 years old, his knees reminded him of every winter he had ever lived through, but he did not mind. The tower and his body had grown old together. At the top, the great lens waited silently. Even after all these years, Elias still admired it. The glass reflected the first hint of morning light. Small rainbows danced across the metal walls. Carefully, he inspected every surface. A lighthouse keeper's work was built upon small details. A single smudge, a single overlooked problem, a single moment of carelessness. That was all it could take. So he checked everything, just as he always had. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon. No ships were visible this morning, only fog, soft and patient, the kind of fog that seemed content to stay all day. Elias leaned against the railing and looked outward. He often imagined the places beyond the horizon: cities, harbors, small fishing villages, busy ports, thousands of people beginning their mornings, people he would never meet, people whose lives touched his only for a moment when they passed through the reach of his light. A gull landed nearby. It tilted its head. Elias smiled. "Good morning," he said softly. The gull offered no reply. It simply stood there, watching the sea. For a few moments they shared the same view, two old residents of Gullstone Point. When he returned downstairs, the lighthouse kitchen was still warm from the previous night's fire. He placed a kettle on the stove. Soon the room filled with the familiar sound of gently heating water. It was one of his favorite sounds. Simple, predictable, comforting. The sort of sound that made a house feel alive. While waiting for his tea, Elias opened a large leather-bound logbook. The pages were yellow with age. Thousands of entries filled its contents. Dates, weather conditions, ship sightings, notes about fog, notes about storms, notes about ordinary days. Most people would have found the book boring. Elias found it fascinating because every line represented a moment that would never exist again, a small piece of time preserved forever. He turned to an entry from 20 years earlier, January 14th, 1938. Heavy fog, moderate wind. 2 cargo ships observed before midnight. Nothing extraordinary. Yet immediately memories returned. He remembered the smell of the sea that night. He remembered the sound of distant bells. He even remembered the cup of tea sitting beside him while he wrote those words. It amazed him how memory worked, how entire worlds could hide inside a few simple sentences. The kettle began to whistle softly. Elias closed the book. Outside, the fog continued drifting across the water. The lighthouse stood quietly above the shoreline. And far beyond the horizon, unseen ships continued their journeys, unaware that an old lighthouse keeper was thinking about them and wondering where they might be going. The fog remained for 3 days. It drifted across the Atlantic like a slow-moving curtain, softening the edges of the world. From the lighthouse balcony, Elias Mercer could barely see the rocky shoreline below. The sea and the sky seemed to blend together into a single shade of gray. And somehow he liked it that way. Fog made the world feel smaller, quieter, more intimate, as though the lighthouse and the ocean were sharing a private conversation. On the fourth morning, the fog finally began to lift. Small patches of blue sky appeared overhead. Sunlight touched the water once again. The gulls seemed pleased by the change. They circled above the cliffs, calling out to one another as if celebrating the return of the horizon. Elias watched them from the lighthouse door while holding a warm cup of tea. The day felt peaceful, ordinary, exactly the kind of day he enjoyed most. Just after noon, a supply boat appeared in the distance. It was a familiar sight. Once every few weeks, a small government vessel visited Gullstone Point. It delivered supplies, fuel, mail, and occasionally a newspaper or two. Nothing exciting, nothing unexpected. The boat always arrived and always left. Just another rhythm in the life of the lighthouse. As the vessel approached the dock below the cliffs, Elias made his way down the narrow path. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and wet stone. Small waves tapped gently against the wooden pier. The captain waved as he stepped ashore. "Good afternoon, Elias." "Good afternoon, Thomas." The two men exchanged smiles. They had known each other for years, not close friends, but familiar companions in a world where familiar faces were rare. Boxes of supplies were unloaded first: flour, coffee, lamp oil, a few canned goods. Then came the mail, just a small stack, usually advertisements, government forms, occasionally a letter from a distant relative, nothing that required much attention. But today one envelope looked different. It was larger, official. Its paper was crisp and unusually formal. In the upper corner appeared the seal of the United States Coast Guard. Elias studied it for a moment, then quietly slipped it into the pocket of his coat. He would read it later. There was no hurry. There never was. By late afternoon, the supply boat had disappeared beyond the horizon. The lighthouse once again stood alone. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. The wind moved softly through the tall grass along the cliffs. Everything felt exactly as it always had. Yet the unopened letter rested heavily in Elias's pocket, waiting, patiently. As evening approached, he carried the envelope into the lighthouse kitchen. A small fire crackled inside the iron stove. The room glowed with warm amber light. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear above the sea. Elias sat at the wooden table. For a long moment, he simply looked at the envelope. Then he carefully opened it. The letter was short, polite, professional, written by someone who had likely never visited Gullstone Point. Someone who had never climbed the lighthouse stairs, never listened to winter storms from inside its walls, never watched dawn arrive across the Atlantic. The message was simple. New automated lighthouse systems would soon be installed. The transition would begin within the year. Once completed, the light would continue operating without a full-time keeper. The lighthouse would no longer require permanent staff. Elias finished reading, then quietly folded the letter. The fire crackled softly nearby. The kettle hummed on the stove. Outside, the ocean continued its endless rhythm. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. He felt no anger, no surprise. Perhaps he had known this day would come. The world was changing. Machines were becoming more capable every year. Across the country, old ways of working were slowly disappearing. Railroads, factories, harbors, and now, lighthouses. For several minutes he sat silently, watching the fire, listening to the wind outside, thinking, not about losing his job, but about losing a routine, a life, a place that had become part of him. After 40 years, the lighthouse no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a companion. Every stair, every window, every creak in the wooden floor. He knew them all, and they knew him. Later that night, Elias climbed to the lantern room. The great light rotated steadily above the dark ocean. Its beams swept across the water. Again, and again, and again. exactly as it had done for decades. Standing beside the lens, Elias looked out across the darkness. Far away, he noticed the faint lights of a ship moving slowly along the horizon, just a few tiny points of light against the night. Most people would have seen only a vessel, but Elias saw something else. He always had. He imagined the people aboard. Perhaps there was a young sailor standing on deck, looking toward the distant shore. Perhaps someone was returning home after months at sea. Perhaps someone was traveling toward a future they had not yet imagined. Perhaps someone was watching the lighthouse beam at that very moment, feeling reassured by its presence. Elias smiled softly. For years, he had created stories about the ships that passed through his light. Tiny stories, simple stories, people he would never meet, lives he would never know. Yet somehow, imagining them made the vast ocean feel less lonely. He walked downstairs and opened another logbook, not an official one, a private one. Its pages were filled with thoughts, sketches, and imagined journeys, the kind of things no government report would ever record. He turned to a blank page, picked up his fountain pen, and began to write. Tonight, a ship crossed the eastern horizon. I do not know its name. I do not know where it is going, but I imagine there is a young man aboard who has not seen home in many months. Perhaps tonight he sees the lighthouse and knows he is one day closer. The pen paused. Elias looked toward the window. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the sea once more, steady, reliable, unchanging. Then he continued writing, and somewhere beyond the darkness, the unknown travelers continued their journeys beneath the stars, unaware that an old lighthouse keeper was quietly imagining their stories and recording them in a book that only he would ever read. That night, long after midnight, the lighthouse remained awake. The ocean remained calm. And on a small wooden desk beneath the tower, a new story had just begun. The lighthouse beam continued its slow journey across the sea. Round and round it turned, steady, patient, unhurried. Outside the lantern room windows, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the winter stars. The night was calm, the kind of calm that seemed to exist only far from cities and busy roads. A calm that belonged entirely to the sea. Elias Mercer sat alone at his wooden desk. The private journal remained open before him. Beside it rested a small oil lamp whose golden light filled the room with warmth. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the lighthouse walls. Inside, everything felt peaceful. For several minutes, Elias stared at the blank page, thinking about the distant ship he had seen crossing the horizon earlier that evening. The vessel was long gone now, hidden somewhere beyond the darkness. Yet in his mind, its journey was only beginning. He dipped his fountain pen into a bottle of ink, then slowly began to write. Tonight, I imagine a young sailor aboard that ship. His name is Daniel Whitaker. He is 23 years old, and he is finally returning home. A small smile appeared on Elias's face. He always gave his travelers names. It somehow made them feel more real, more alive, as though they truly existed somewhere beyond the reach of the lighthouse. In Elias's imagination, Daniel stood alone near the ship's railing. His dark wool coat fluttered softly in the ocean breeze. Above him, countless stars filled the sky. The sea reflected their light like scattered silver. The journey had already lasted many months, long enough for Daniel to forget what it felt like to sleep in a quiet room, long enough to miss the ordinary comforts of home. As the ship moved steadily through the darkness, Daniel looked toward the distant shoreline. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the small town where he had grown up, a place of narrow streets, wooden houses, fishing boats, and familiar faces. He imagined the harbor exactly as he remembered it, the old bakery near the waterfront, the church bell that rang every Sunday morning, the small grocery store where everyone seemed to know one another. Simple places, ordinary places, yet somehow the most important places in the world. The longer a person traveled, Elias believed, the more precious ordinary things became. A familiar chair, a favorite window, a warm kitchen, the sound of someone's voice welcoming you home. Outside the lighthouse, the waves rolled gently against the rocky coastline. Their rhythm blended with the scratching sound of Elias's pen moving across the page. In the story unfolding before him, Daniel reached into his coat pocket. Inside was a folded letter. The edges were worn from being opened many times. He had read it so often that he nearly knew every word by heart. Yet tonight, beneath the stars, he unfolded it once more. The letter had come from his mother, written months earlier. Its words were simple. She described the weather, the fishing boats, the neighbors. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, just small pieces of daily life. And somehow those simple details mattered most. They reminded Daniel that life continued while he was away. The town remained. The people remained. Home remained. Waiting patiently. Elias paused for a moment. He looked out the window. The lighthouse beams swept across the dark water again. Far below, white waves shimmered briefly before disappearing back into darkness. He often wondered if real sailors felt this way, if they spent long nights imagining home, if they counted the days, if they remembered small details that others might overlook. Perhaps they did. Perhaps everyone carried a little piece of home wherever they went. The oil lamp flickered softly. Its light danced across the journal pages. Elias continued writing. In his imagination, Daniel walked slowly across the deck. Most of the crew had already gone below. The night belonged to silence, to stars, to thoughts. Above him, the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. Daniel stopped near the bow of the ship and looked upward. For a moment, he felt very small. A single person crossing a vast ocean beneath an endless universe. And strangely, that feeling brought comfort rather than fear. There was peace in knowing that the stars had watched countless travelers before him. Sailors, fishermen, explorers, families, dreamers, all moving beneath the same sky, all searching for something. Back at Gullstone Point Lighthouse, Elias leaned back in his chair. The room was warm, the ocean outside remained calm, and his imagined traveler continued sailing toward home. Hours passed quietly. The lighthouse light continued turning. The stars slowly crossed the heavens. The tide rose and fell, as it always had, as it always would. Elias eventually placed his pen down. The page was nearly full now. Daniel's journey would continue another night. There was no reason to rush. The best stories move slowly, just like the sea. He carefully closed the journal, then carried it to a small shelf beside his bed. The room had grown quiet. Only the distant sound of waves remained. Before extinguishing the lamp, Elias looked one final time through the window. The horizon had disappeared into darkness. The distant ship was gone, invisible. Yet somewhere out there, real travelers continued crossing the ocean beneath the stars, and perhaps one of them truly was returning home. Daniel Whitaker remained in the harbor longer than he had expected. The captain had said the cargo ship would only stay for a few short hours before continuing south along the coast. But to Daniel, even a few hours on land felt like a gift. After many nights at sea, there was something deeply comforting about stepping onto a quiet dock and hearing the sound of wood beneath his boots instead of the steady hum of a ship's engine. The harbor was small, not the sort of harbor that appeared in travel books or postcards. There were no grand stone buildings, no busy markets, no crowds of visitors from faraway places. It was a working harbor, simple, honest, peaceful. A row of fishing boats rested beside the wooden piers, their ropes creaking softly in the morning breeze. A few gulls drifted overhead, calling to one another as if they had nowhere in particular to be. Thin trails of smoke rose from the chimneys of houses tucked farther up the hill. Somewhere nearby, Daniel could smell fresh bread baking. It was the kind of place where the day seemed to begin slowly, and perhaps that was why he liked it so much. He walked along the waterfront without any hurry at all. The cold morning air brushed softly against his face. His boots moved over weathered planks and patches of stone worn smooth by many years of footsteps. He passed a small bait shop with faded paint on its sign. A fisherman stood beside a stack of lobster pots, carefully mending a torn net with practiced hands. An old truck rolled slowly past with crates in the back. Nothing about the harbor was dramatic, and yet everything about it felt deeply alive. Daniel paused beside the end of the dock and looked back toward the cargo ship. From this distance, it seemed larger than it had while he stood upon it. Its dark shape rested quietly against the pale water, patient and still. In a few hours, it would carry him away again. Back into the long, breathing silence of the Atlantic. Back toward days that looked very much like one another. But for now, there was land beneath his feet, and that was enough. He kept walking. At the edge of the harbor stood a small bakery with frosted windows and a brass bell above the door. Warm golden light spilled out onto the street. Daniel hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The bakery was quiet except for the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere in the back room. The air smelled of cinnamon, fresh bread, and coffee. A woman behind the counter smiled and asked if he had just come in from one of the ships. Daniel nodded and ordered a cup of coffee and a sweet roll that was still warm from the oven. He carried them to a table by the window and sat there for a while, simply watching the harbor wake up. A man in a heavy wool coat crossed the street with a newspaper tucked under one arm. Two boys hurried toward the docks, laughing as they chased one another through the cold. A dog barked somewhere near the fish market. The church bell rang the hour, low and steady. Daniel took his time with the coffee. He took his time with the sweet roll too. Not because he was hungry, though he was, but because the warmth of the bakery reminded him of home. It reminded him of winter mornings long ago, when his mother would leave bread cooling by the kitchen window, and his father would already be outside before sunrise, preparing the boat. There was a softness to the memory, a softness that only seemed to visit him when he was far from home. When he finished, he thanked the woman behind the counter and stepped back into the harbor street. The sunlight had grown stronger now. The last traces of early fog had faded from the water. The town had fully awakened. Daniel wandered uphill along a narrow road lined with weathered houses, white fences, and small front gardens sleeping beneath the cold of winter. He passed a barber shop with a striped pole in the window, a hardware store with old tools displayed behind dusty glass, a post office no larger than a cottage. Everything felt familiar, though he had never been there before. That was the strange comfort of small coastal towns. They each had their own names, their own people, their own stories. And yet, in quiet ways, they resembled one another. They all seemed to belong to the same world of salt air, wooden docks, gulls, and weather. At the top of the hill, Daniel found a bench overlooking the harbor. He sat there for a while, coat buttoned against the wind, and watched the boats below. From up there, the town looked almost toy-like. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin silver lines. The harbor water shimmered beneath the winter sun. The little bakery looked no larger than a matchbox. And beyond everything else, stretching far beyond the harbor mouth, was the Atlantic. Wide, endless, patient. Daniel wondered how many sailors had stood in that same spot over the years. How many had looked down at the harbor and felt the same mixture of peace and longing. He wondered how many had promised themselves that one day they would stop sailing and choose a quieter life on shore. It was an easy promise to make on a peaceful morning like this one. Whether it was easy to keep was another matter entirely. Far away in the lantern room of Gullstone Point Lighthouse, Elias Mercer sat at his desk and continued writing Daniel's story. The journal lay open before him. The words came slowly, but they came. Elias could see the harbor clearly in his mind, not because he had ever visited that exact place, but because he had known many harbors like it. He had seen them from ships in younger years. He had stepped into them on supply runs. He had passed through them on foggy mornings and bright summer afternoons. Some had been larger, some had been poorer. Some had been nearly forgotten by the rest of the world, but all of them had carried the same quiet rhythm, a rhythm of ropes and gulls and weathered docks, a rhythm of men who rose before dawn and women who kept warm kitchens waiting at home. Elias paused and looked out the lantern room window. The sea below Gullstone Point was bright now, the fog from earlier days finally gone. The winter sun lay across the water like a path of silver. For a moment, Elias was no longer 68 years old. For a moment, he was 27 again, stepping from a small boat onto the lonely rocks of Gullstone Point for the first time. He remembered the sound of the surf. He remembered the smell of salt and cold iron. He remembered looking up at the white tower and thinking that he might stay there only a few seasons, a year or two at most. Then he smiled to himself. 41 years had passed since that morning. 41 years of storms and lamp oil and logbooks and lonely winter nights. 41 years of watching ships appear and disappear beyond the horizon. 41 years of being the steady light at the edge of the world. It had not been the life he expected, but perhaps it had become the life he needed. He returned his attention to the page. In the harbor, Daniel rose from the bench and made his way back toward the waterfront. The cargo ship would not wait forever. Already he could hear activity at the docks growing louder. Crates being moved. Voices calling from one boat to another. The low groan of ropes being tightened. The harbor had changed since morning. It was no longer half asleep. Now it moved with purpose, and yet the calm remained. Daniel stopped once more near the harbor entrance, where a small white lighthouse stood on the rocks beside the channel. It was a modest tower, nothing like Gullstone Point in Elias's imagination, but there was something comforting about it. Its white paint shone in the winter sun. Its lantern room windows flashed briefly whenever the light struck them just right, and the sight of it stirred something inside Daniel. A feeling he could not quite name. Safety, perhaps, or guidance, or simply the old quiet reassurance that no matter how far a sailor wandered, there would always be lights waiting along the shore. He stood there for several minutes, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the slow hush of water against the rocks. Then he turned and walked back to the ship. The captain greeted him with a nod. One of the crewmen was already untying the last line from the dock. Another carried a crate of supplies up the gangway. The gulls wheeled overhead as if they had come to watch the departure. Daniel climbed aboard and paused at the rail. He looked once more at the little harbor town, at the bakery windows catching the sun, at the hill with its scattered houses, at the small lighthouse near the harbor mouth, at the boats rocking gently in the water. It was a simple place, but for a few quiet hours, it had felt almost like home. Then the cargo ship eased away from the dock. The harbor slowly widened behind them. The little lighthouse grew smaller. The church steeple became only a dark line against the sky. The bakery disappeared from sight. Soon there was only the open Atlantic again, blue-gray and endless. Daniel stayed at the railing until the town was gone. Only then did he draw a slow breath and turn back toward the deck. There were still many miles ahead, still many nights beneath the stars, still many harbors yet unseen. But the morning ashore had left something behind in him, a quiet steadiness, a feeling of warmth he could carry into the days ahead. And far away at Gullstone Point, Elias Mercer wrote the final lines of the chapter in his journal. Outside, the sea moved in long, gentle swells beneath the winter sky. The lighthouse stood above the cliffs as it always had, patient and watchful. Elias set down his pen and rested his hand on the open page. For a little while he simply listened, to the wind brushing softly against the glass, to the distant cry of gulls, to the familiar hush of waves below. And in that peaceful stillness, he imagined Daniel Whitaker once more at sea, carrying the memory of a small harbor like a lantern in his heart. By nightfall, the harbor was gone. There was no sign of the little bakery, no trace of the hillside houses, no white lighthouse standing at the mouth of the channel. There was only the Atlantic again, endless, dark, and calm beneath a sky full of stars. Daniel Whitaker stood alone at the ship's rail, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat as the cold wind moved gently around him. Behind him, the low sounds of the cargo ship carried on as they always did. The hum of the engine, the faint rattle of chains, the quiet footsteps of a crewman crossing the deck. But out beyond the ship, the sea seemed almost silent. He looked back once, though there was nothing left to see. The harbor had disappeared into the darkness long ago, and yet Daniel could still picture it clearly. The warm bakery windows, the church bell, the bench above the hill, the small white lighthouse by the rocks. For only a few hours, that town had given him something he had not realized he needed. Not excitement, not adventure, only stillness. The kind of stillness that stayed with a man after he had left. He drew a slow breath and lifted his eyes to the stars. They seemed brighter out here, far from the lights of shore. Thousands of them scattered across the sky like tiny silver lanterns. Daniel had spent enough nights at sea to know that the ocean could be harsh, restless, and lonely. But on nights like this, it felt almost gentle, as if the world had decided, just for a little while, to be quiet. He remained at the rail until the cold reached his hands and cheeks. Then at last he turned and made his way below deck. In the small cabin he shared with another sailor, Daniel sat on the edge of his bunk and reached into his coat pocket. From inside, he pulled the folded letter from his mother. The paper was worn soft now from being opened so many times. He did not read it right away. Instead, he placed it beside him and listened to the muffled sounds of the ship around him. The steady engine, the creak of timber, the hush of water passing along the hull. It was a different kind of music from the harbor, but it carried the same quiet comfort. After a while, he unfolded the letter and read it once more beneath the small yellow cabin light. Her words were simple. She wrote about the kitchen garden behind the house, about the old church roof that still leaked when it rained, about a neighbor who had bought a new fishing boat and painted it blue. There was nothing grand in the letter, no great news, no tragedy, no urgency, only the ordinary details of life continuing at home. And somehow, that was what Daniel loved most about it. It reminded him that somewhere beyond the sea, there was still a place where mornings began with coffee and gulls and the sound of a door opening into the cold. A place where life moved at a gentler pace. A place that waited without asking questions. Far away at Gullstone Point Lighthouse, Elias Mercer sat in the lantern room, with his journal still open before him. The great beam turned slowly through the night, sending its light across the dark Atlantic. Elias had written many pages now about Daniel Whitaker, and yet he felt there was still more to tell. He could imagine Daniel in the little cabin below deck, reading the same letter again, listening to the sea beyond the walls. He could imagine the young sailor carrying the memory of that harbor into sleep. Elias smiled faintly and dipped his pen once more into the ink. Outside, the ocean moved in long black swells beneath the stars. Inside, the warm lamp glowed against the wooden walls of the lighthouse. And as the night deepened, Elias began to write about the dreams that sometimes came to sailors far from shore. Dreams of warm kitchens, familiar footsteps, and quiet lights waiting in distant windows. That night, the sea remained calm. The cargo ship moved steadily through the darkness, its engine humming low and constant beneath the floor of Daniel Whitaker's small cabin. He had finished reading his mother's letter, but he did not put it away right away. Instead, he sat quietly on the edge of his bunk with the folded paper resting in his hands, listening to the familiar sounds of the ship, the creak of timber, the soft shudder of metal, the hush of water gliding along the hull. These were sounds he had known for years now. And yet, after the quiet warmth of the harbor and the comfort of the letter, they felt different tonight, softer somehow, less lonely. Daniel set the letter on the small table beside his bunk and loosened the collar of his coat. The cabin light was dim and yellow, just bright enough to cast a warm circle across the wooden walls. Outside the round porthole window, there was only darkness and the occasional shimmer of moonlight on the water. He lay back slowly, pulling the wool blanket over himself as the ship carried him farther south through the winter night. For a little while he kept his eyes open. He watched the weak glow of the cabin lamp and listened to the rhythm of the ship. The engine below, the quiet sway of the mattress, the distant footsteps of a crewman somewhere overhead. Everything moved in a pattern so steady, so familiar, that it almost felt like breathing. Daniel thought once more of the harbor town he had left behind that morning, of the bakery windows lit gold against the cold, of the bench above the hill, of the little white lighthouse standing patiently beside the channel. And then little by little those memories began to drift and soften. The cabin seemed warmer. The sounds of the ship grew farther away. And at last, Daniel closed his eyes. In his sleep, he found himself walking along a quiet road at the edge of his hometown. It was early evening there. The sky was painted in pale shades of blue and rose, and the last light of day rested softly on the harbor water. He walked past familiar houses with white fences and small front gardens. He could smell supper cooking somewhere nearby. A church bell rang in the distance, not loud, not urgent, just a single gentle sound carried on the evening air. At the bottom of the hill, his mother stood in the doorway of the house, one hand resting against the frame as if she had been waiting for him. Warm light spilled out behind her from the kitchen. Daniel could see the table already set. He could see the kettle steaming softly on the stove. And though she did not call out, he somehow knew he was expected. He walked toward the house slowly, as if afraid the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. The gravel path crunched softly beneath his boots. The porch light glowed against the winter dusk. Somewhere beyond the houses, gulls cried faintly over the harbor. It all felt so real that for a moment he forgot entirely about the ship and the ocean and the long miles still ahead of him. There was only home, only warmth, only the quiet comfort of belonging somewhere. Far away at Gullstone Point Lighthouse, Elias Mercer sat awake long after midnight. The lantern beam turned slowly through the darkness, sweeping its light across the Atlantic. His journal remained open on the desk, though he had stopped writing for the moment. He was listening too, listening to the sea below the cliffs, listening to the old timbers of the lighthouse settle in the cold, listening to the silence between the sounds. He imagined Daniel asleep below deck, carried gently by the ship through the night, dreaming of home without even realizing it. And Elias, with the patience of a man who had spent most of his life beside the sea, smiled softly and picked up his pen once more. Then he began to write about the road in Daniel's dream, the warm house at the end of it, and the light in the doorway that never truly went out. Daniel walked slowly up the gravel path toward the house, as though he were afraid the dream might vanish if he moved too quickly. The evening air was cool and still. A faint golden light glowed from the kitchen windows, spilling softly across the porch and the patch of grass beside the steps. Everything looked exactly as he remembered. The white paint on the porch railing, the old brass doorknob polished by years of use, the small wooden bench beneath the front window where his father used to sit on summer evenings, mending nets or simply watching the street grow quiet at sunset. For a moment, Daniel stopped at the foot of the porch and simply looked. He could hear the kettle softly rattling on the stove inside. He could smell warm bread and something sweet baking in the kitchen. And through the open doorway, he could see his mother waiting there, calm and patient, as if she had known all along that he would come home tonight. She smiled when she saw him. It was not a surprise smile, not the smile of someone greeting a stranger after a long absence. It was the easy, gentle smile of a mother who had only stepped into the next room and expected her son to follow. Daniel climbed the porch steps slowly. The boards creaked beneath his boots in the same familiar way they always had. When he reached the doorway, his mother touched his arm lightly and stepped aside to let him in. The kitchen was warm enough to make him forget the cold of the sea. The yellow light from the lamp above the table gave the whole room a soft golden glow. A loaf of bread rested on a cloth near the counter. The kettle steamed gently on the stove. 2 bowls sat waiting on the table, and beside them a small jar of jam caught the light like red glass. Nothing in the room was grand. The wallpaper was old. The floorboards were worn smooth. The curtains by the window had been mended more than once. And yet to Daniel, it felt more beautiful than any grand house he had ever seen in a harbor city. Because it was home, his mother moved quietly around the kitchen, pouring tea into 2 cups and setting one in front of him. Daniel sat down at the table, and for a little while neither of them said very much. They did not need to. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of the small comforts of home, the ticking of the wall clock, the gentle clink of a spoon against a cup, the faint hiss of the stove. At last, his mother asked him whether the sea had been kind. Daniel thought about the question for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he said softly. She smiled again, as if she understood more than he had spoken aloud. Then she asked about the places he had seen, the towns, the docks, the distant coastlines. Daniel told her about the little harbor from the day before, the bakery windows glowing against the cold, the bench above the hill, and the small white lighthouse standing beside the channel. As he spoke, it no longer felt like a place he had merely passed through. In the warmth of the kitchen, it felt as if the harbor had become part of him, a quiet place he could return to in memory whenever the ocean felt too wide. His mother listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her teacup. When he finished, she nodded once and said, "Some places are small enough to fit inside your pocket, but warm enough to stay with you for years." Daniel looked down at his cup and smiled. It sounded exactly like something she would say. Outside the kitchen window, the evening deepened into night. The last pale blue faded from the sky. A few stars appeared above the rooftops. Somewhere down by the harbor, a gull cried once, then fell silent. The whole town seemed to be settling into sleep. After a while, Daniel rose from the table and crossed to the window. From there, he could just make out the harbor at the bottom of the hill, dark and peaceful beneath the stars. The masts of the fishing boats stood in silhouette against the sky. A faint lantern glowed at the dock, and far beyond the houses, the water of the bay reflected the moon in a long silver path. He stood there quietly, one hand resting against the window frame, feeling a calmness he had not known in a very long time. No ship's engine, no creak of ropes, no long miles of open water ahead, only the stillness of home, only the knowledge that, for tonight at least, he did not have to keep moving. Far away in the lantern room of Gullstone Point Lighthouse, Elias Mercer continued writing by the warm light of his oil lamp. The beam of the lighthouse turned slowly through the darkness, sweeping over the black Atlantic and the empty winter sky. Elias could almost see Daniel there in the dream, standing at the kitchen window of the house on the hill. He could picture the quiet room behind him, the teacup on the table, the mother who asked gentle questions and never demanded more than her son was ready to give. Elias Mercer. Before dawn, Daniel Whitaker woke to silence. Not complete silence, of course. A ship at sea was never truly silent. There was still the low, steady hum of the engine somewhere below, still the soft creak of timber as the cargo ship moved with the rhythm of the Atlantic, still the hush of water brushing along the hull in the darkness outside. But it was a gentler silence than the one he had known before sleep, a softer one, the kind of silence that lingers at the edge of morning when the world has not quite decided to wake. For a few moments, Daniel remained still beneath the wool blanket, his eyes half open in the dim yellow light of the cabin lamp. He did not move right away. He simply listened to the ship, to the sea, to the fading warmth of the dream he had carried with him through the night. The dream had already begun to drift away, as dreams always do, and yet pieces of it remained. The porch light glowing in the dusk, his mother standing in the doorway, the kitchen table set for supper, the quiet road leading home. None of it felt distant. Not yet. It rested inside him with the same softness as the letter folded on the small table beside his bunk. Daniel turned his head and looked toward the porthole. Outside, the darkness had begun to thin. The sky beyond the glass was no longer black, but deep blue, touched faintly with the first pale hint of morning. He pushed back the blanket, sat up slowly, and rubbed a hand across his face. For a moment, he could not remember where the dream had ended and the waking world had begun. Then the cold cabin air reached him, and the steady sway of the ship returned him fully to the Atlantic. He reached for his coat, slipped it on, and took the folded letter from the table. As he tucked it safely into his pocket, he found himself smiling. Not because anything had changed. The miles ahead were still long. The ocean was still wide. There would still be cold mornings, restless weather, and distant ports waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. And yet something inside him felt quieter now, as if the harbor, the dream, and the memory of home had settled into place beside one another, as if he had been carrying a kind of homesickness for so long that he had forgotten it could grow lighter. Daniel climbed the narrow steps to the deck just as the first edge of dawn appeared over the Atlantic. The air was cold and clean. The sea stretched out in every direction, calm and silver blue beneath the waking sky. Above the eastern horizon, the first pale light spread slowly across the clouds, turning them from charcoal to lavender, then from lavender to soft rose. The stars faded one by one. The ship moved steadily onward. Daniel walked to the rail and rested his hands there, gazing out at the open water. He drew in a slow breath of salt air and let it out again. There was no harbor in sight, no lighthouse, no familiar rooftops or church bells or glowing bakery windows. Only the sea, only the morning. Only the long road of water carrying him toward places still unknown. And somehow, that no longer felt lonely. Not in the way it once had. He thought of the little town he had visited only for a few hours, of the bench above the hill, of the white harbor light beside the channel, of the warmth in the bakery windows, and the stillness of the church bell at morning. He thought of his mother's kitchen in the dream, and of the way the porch light had shone across the path, as though it had been waiting for him all along. Some places, he realized, did not belong to the map alone. Some places belonged to the heart. A harbor could do that. A home could do that. Even a dream could do that. The sun rose slowly above the horizon, and a long path of gold spread over the Atlantic water. Daniel watched it in silence. He did not know what the next port would bring. He did not know how many more months he would spend aboard the cargo ship, or how many more towns he would pass through before he finally chose to stay ashore. But for the first time in many years, he did not feel as though he were drifting without anchor. He carried one now, not a heavy one of iron and chain, a quieter one, made of memory, of warm rooms and lamplight, of small harbors and familiar voices, of a lighthouse seen from far away and the steady promise of home. At Gullstone Point Lighthouse, Elias Mercer was awake as well. He had not slept much. The lantern room was filled with the pale blue hush that comes just before sunrise. His journal lay open on the desk where he had left it during the night. The oil lamp had burned low, and the great lighthouse beam still turned above him with its faithful, unhurried rhythm. Elias stood by the window and looked out at the sea below the cliffs. The Atlantic was calm this morning. The last darkness was fading from the water, and the first light of dawn touched the tops of the waves with silver. He imagined Daniel standing on the deck of the cargo ship somewhere far to the south, watching the same sunrise from another corner of the ocean. That thought pleased him. Two men, many miles apart, held for a moment beneath the same quiet sky, one beginning the day at sea, the other ending a story at the edge of the land. Elias returned to the desk and sat down slowly. His hand rested on the open page of the journal. He read over the final lines he had written in the night, then picked up his pen one last time. The words came gently now, as though they had been waiting for the dawn. He wrote that the sea had a way of taking things from a man: time, certainty, warmth, and sometimes even the shape of home. But every so often, if a man was patient, the sea also gave something back. A quiet harbor, a remembered voice, a dream carried safely through the dark, a light at the far edge of morning. When Elias finished, he set down the pen and closed the journal with both hands. The sound was soft in the stillness of the lantern room. For a little while, he simply sat there, listening to the gulls beginning to stir outside, listening to the wind moving lightly against the glass, listening to the familiar hush of the waves below Gullstone Point. 41 years he had spent with those sounds, 41 years of storms and winter tides and lantern light turning over the sea. He had watched ships come and go. He had watched young sailors disappear beyond the horizon and older men return with quieter eyes. He had watched seasons pass across the Atlantic, each one carrying its own weather, its own loneliness, its own small mercies. And now, with the dawn gathering around the lighthouse, Elias felt the deep and simple peace of a story finally reach. its end. Not because everything had been answered, not because the road ahead was finished, but because some endings do not close a journey. They simply make it gentler. Outside, the sun rose higher. The beam of Gullstone Point Lighthouse grew fainter in the growing light, until at last it was no longer needed. Far out on the Atlantic, Daniel Whitaker remained at the rail, watching morning spread across the sea. Behind him, the cargo ship carried on toward another day. Ahead of him, the water shone like a road of gold. And within him, somewhere quiet and steady, the warmth of home remained. The dream would fade, the miles would continue, the weather would change, but he would carry that warmth with him now. Into the next harbor, into the next night, into every quiet hour before dawn. And on the rocky coast of Maine, Gullstone Point Lighthouse stood above the sea exactly as it always had, patient, watchful, and full of light.
Dears, it was my finally storytelling video. Please give me like, comment and subscribe my channel. Good night and sweet dream. Bye bye.